Hello. My name is Shauna Lipton. I'm the director of the graduate school here at Pacific Northwest College of Art. Thank you all for being here, for participating in this event, exploring DIY histories, aesthetics, politics, archives, and world making. Thank you to Megan Gilligan-Kane, my co-organizer and the powerhouse behind this entire symposium. Thank you to the staff of the Hallie Ford School of Graduate Studies, Randy, Aaron, and Simone. Thank you to all of the talented graduate students who led workshops, all of the zine makers who exhibited today, to Jason and to Hannah for curating the exhibition in the atrium, and for all of the participating artists, to Amisa Chu and Mick Rose for leading a rich conversation on DIY today, and to our first keynote speaker, Skawennati, and everyone else who provided support and helped make this event happen. The theme of this symposium was inspired by the queer, punk, feminist, DIY ethos of the Pacific Northwest and the desire to explore what DIY means in this moment of the ongoing pandemic and how the circumstances of systemic failure and neglect of marginalized communities has highlighted both the strategic violence of our successfully failing institutions and the flourishing creativity, craftiness, resilience, and resistance of so many artists and makers who create community, sovereignty, and brilliance. Please scan the QR code in our program for a list of resources and links where you can materially support our Indigenous community in Portland and beyond. I would now like to welcome Critical Studies MA candidate and curatorial fellow Jason Lay to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Before we begin, I just want to remind every single one of us that as we gather here tonight, we are located on the ancestral but stolen territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes whose home is here along the Columbia River, and whose elders, past and present, we acknowledge with respect. We must not forget nor take lightly how systemic policies of settler colonialism that result in genocide, relocation, assimilation, continue to directly affect many Indigenous and Native families today. This acknowledgement, nor any future acknowledgement, will ever be enough to correct the injustices that have taken place, nor diminish any scars or open wounds. But anything, hopefully, is better than remaining silent and complicit. It is our responsibility as guests of these lands and as global citizens that we never stop working towards the rematriation of Native lands and the correction of social injustices. So once again, I want to thank you all for gathering here with us tonight for the Hallie Ford School of Graduate Studies 2022, Graduate Symposium. As Shauna mentioned, my name is Jason. I'm the first year MA Critical Studies candidate here at PNCA and the current Graduate Curatorial Fellow. And it's with immense pleasure that I get to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Demian DinéYazhi. Demian, born originally in New Mexico to Clans of the Diné, is an alum of PNCA, graduating with a BFA in Intermediate Arts. Although our paths never really directly crossed, I was working on my BFA in printmaking at the same time, and so I had the immense pleasure of witnessing from a close distance essentially the start of Damian's career. I very distinctly remember your work at the time, Bury My Art at Wounded Knee, which was a curatorial exhibition that you did for your thesis, and how inspiring it was to see a non-white person fight against what was expected of them, create what needed to be created for them, and to push against the white walls we exist within. And so for that, I just want to thank you personally. Demian is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including PICA's Precipice Fund, the Crow's Shadow Golden Spot Residency, and the Hallie Ford Fellowship. Demian has also exhibited internationally across the United States of America and Australia, and has had work selected for permanent collections within the Portland Art Museum and the Whitney Museum of Art. They have generated and headed numerous important transdisciplinary projects that challenge the status quo of white supremacy and unjust political ideology, such as RISE, Radical Indigenous Survivance and Empowerment, Make Native America Great Again, Pause Since 1492, and A Nation is a Massacre. They also actively publish poetry and creative writing, with titles such as Ancestral Memory, their 2016 poetry debut, and the long-form prose poem, An Infected Sunset, which was presented in conjunction with the exhibition Between the Waters at the Whitney. Through text, image, installation, curation, language, resistance, refusal, existence, and many more avenues, Demian and their work remind us of the power and importance of questioning, of subversion, and of not giving in, especially for BIPOC and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ community members. So without further delay, I generously thank Demian for the work and invite them to speak to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. One second. All right. Yate, my name is Demian DinéYazhi. I'm born to the clans Nestaje Tabahe and Todachitni of the Diné tribe. I grew up in the reservation border town of Gallup, New Mexico. I currently live here in Portland. And my family is from the Chinle Valley, which is located on the Navajo Nation. And all of this can be read in this wonderfully printed out accompaniment. Thank you for printing that out prior to this. I'd like to start off by extending gratitude and reverence to all the indigenous peoples whose land we occupy as both welcome and unwelcomed guests. I'd like to acknowledge the original caretakers whose ancestral lands we now infiltrate with our dreams, desires, and next of kin. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Chinook tribe, Multnomah, Kalapuya, Cathlamet, Cowlitz, Clackamas, Malala, Tualatin, Wasco, and all the tribes who have traversed, traded, and nurtured this land and will continue to do so in the future. A few years ago, I was asked to read a poem at, I think it was like one of the opening festivities here at PNCA. That poem was accompanied by a printout. But at the time, it was one of the first sort of land acknowledgements that I had, given here at PNCA that I had heard around the Pacific Northwest region, especially within our institutions. And since then, I've seen this indigenous practice, co-opted, appropriated, and stolen and used by various institutions and organizations that have failed to properly give up land, water, and various types of resources to indigenous communities. I bring this up because I don't think that, my personal land acknowledgement was stolen or appropriated, but I think the act of utilizing land acknowledgements as a way to avoid any sort of actual involvement and solidarity with indigenous communities, is something that comes from a very problematic place. While I think, many indigenous tribes appreciate the acknowledgement, we strive for actions beyond just witnessing and acknowledging our contributions to these lands that have been colonized and brutalized repeatedly through colonial conquest and modern forms of gentrification, and displacement of houseless individuals, with the Ritz-Carlton going up. We strive for actions that lead to indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation. We strive for reproductive rights, gender and body sovereignty, queer, trans, and two-spirit empowerment, and we demand environmental justice. I think in order for us to be giving land acknowledgements, we need to actually be looking at the ways that we benefit from different types of privileges and acknowledge and figure out ways that we actually create meaningful ties and relationships with indigenous peoples. A lot of the times indigenous organizations and institutions will reach out, but won't actually put in the time and effort to solidify long-term engagement, relationships, and support for indigenous communities. I'd also like to take a moment to honor all the lives that have so far and will continue to be lost during this pandemic. as well as the elder, disabled, and immunocompromised community members that to this day navigate public spaces troubled by the failures of local, regional, and national public health standards and initiatives. I'd like to thank everyone here at PNCA who helped organize this weekend's graduate symposium and whose labor continues to help bring radical programming and dialogues to the art school industrial complex. With that, I would like to thank you all for coming here tonight and supporting a local Indigenous queer artist. So I will sort of just start by giving a little bit of context. This is where my family is, well, this is partially where one side of my family is from. This is my, a photograph of a hogan that some people in my family helped to construct back in the 80s. A hogan is a traditional dwelling for Indigenous Diné Navajo folks. You know, within contemporary terms, most Indigenous Navajo people, you know, live in either houses that they construct themselves, trailers, you know, manufacture homes, and so the hogan has now kind of like been utilized as a ceremonial space. Traditionally, you know, there were like female and male hogans or female or male sides of the hogan. To this day, this structure still stands on my mother's my mother's property. And this is a picture of my grandfather who was a code talker. And yeah, this is just a little bit of where I come from. But I wanted to start off the actual lecture talking about my time here at PNCA and sort of like what you know drove my inspiration to work in the ways that I have as an Indigenous artist, as an artist in general. You know, I initially moved to Portland inspired by the DIY sensibilities and history of the region. I was really into like Riot Girl, Bikini Kill, Slater Kinney. And so, you know, as I was doing research and kind of thinking about like what it would mean to live outside of New Mexico, you know, one of the first places that I gravitated toward was the Pacific Northwest, whether it was Olympia or Seattle or Portland. But, you know, Portland kind of stuck out to me because, well, Slater Kinney was still, you know, living and performing here. And the gossip was like, you know, Beth Ditto was like moving in and out of Portland. You know, and by the time I actually decided to move here back in 2006, it was like one of the last shows that Slater Kinney was performing at the Crystal Ballroom. And at that point, you know, I think, you know, a lot of that radical Riot Girl energy was sort of like dissolving. I mean, some of it was still in place through, you know, bands like the New Bloods, Gossip, Erase Errata. You know, there were still sort of like remnants of that energy like still alive throughout the Pacific Northwest and in Portland in general. But it, you know, a lot of that I think was starting to change. And so, you know, I moved to Portland kind of like really hungry and like thirsting for having exposure to like this type of energy. Not realizing that I was also like moving into like one of the whitest cities in America. And so I think at that point I was moving around Portland, like going down Stark Street and like just drinking a shit ton and trying to like figure out like how to build community or how to be a queer person, like how to survive in like this new place that wasn't, you know, New Mexico. I think what I immediately confronted was like the racist like undertones or tones of like queer community and queer culture in Portland. And so, which I think, you know, also just like drove up like this like weird alienated kind of energy that like only pushed me to like take less care of myself and, be, ultimately like irresponsible. And so, I think a lot of that like self-destructive like energy like eventually led me to applying to PNCA. I kept seeing like the pamphlets all over town and was just like, I don't know what the fuck this school is, but like I'm going to apply to it. And if I apply to it and I get accepted, then like I'm going to like devote myself to like this, path of like being an artist. And so I did. And at that point, I spent the next 4.5 years like just really dedicating myself to figuring out my craft and figuring out like what it meant to be an artist or what it meant for myself to be an artist. Not realizing that, PNCA was also just had like a really amazing faculty. I didn't realize like the types of conversations that we would engage in. I didn't realize like how important like critique spaces and conversations are, even though a lot of the times critique was like really impossible or really hard and difficult for me to have as a Native student or as a queer student. And and what I also realized at throughout my time here at PNCA was also just the exclusion of Indigenous, Black, Latin, Asian Pacific Islander art histories, and even queer art histories, that we are forced to like learn and historicize and write about. And so that eventually, led me to my senior year thesis project and thesis proposal, which, at the time, the only other sort of like experience that I had in curation was through Queer Union. And we had curated this exhibition in the park blocks by the Everett Street Lofts. That was titled "Where Do We Go From Here? HIV and AIDS-Related Art and Activism." And we had, during that exhibition, had brought together this like national survey of contemporary queer artists who were exploring HIV and AIDS-related art within their practices. That eventually led me to thinking about like curation as like a site for like activism and subversion and, just unsettling, artistic and social landscapes. And so for my senior thesis, had thought of putting together this exhibition titled "Bury My Art at Wounded Knee, Blood and Guts in the Art School Industrial Complex." A lot of the call for this exhibition was through Tumblr and word of mouth, and then also reaching out to Indigenous communities and Indigenous artists who I had known. A lot of my initial interest and research began through some of the art history courses here and thinking about the exclusion of Indigenous art and art practices. And what am I trying to say next? And so for the purposes of moving forward with the thesis exhibition, I realized that one of the strongest ways that I could actually respond and hold PNCA accountable for excluding Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures and communities was to curate an exhibition that highlighted living Indigenous artists. The entire time that I had attended PNCA, there were no exhibitions that had highlighted Indigenous artists or that highlighted either like an Indigenous solo artist or that even had like a survey of Indigenous art or like through a lot of the that had a lot of like Indigenous artwork exhibited through the PNCA galleries. So for this exhibition, I thought it was, and I still think that this is important for my practice to this day. And I think maybe it's, my foray into doing work as like a DIY artist, comes more from like a stubborn streak or a stubborn bone, of realizing that like it's important for both myself and for Indigenous artists to be creating all aspects of our work from beginning to finish. I think this is important also as queer people. So for the purposes of the exhibition, it was important for every aspect of the exhibition to have my hand and labor and body involved throughout the whole process. So in creating posters and creating show cards, in doing any type of like press or design, the entire process was created, managed, and labored, by myself. Not only as like an Indigenous artist, but also as a queer artist, as an Indigenous queer artist. I did not paint that wall. I do want to give props to a lot of queer and ally friends who came together and hand painted that on my behalf in like 2 days. It was really amazing and beautiful to watch. And so what ended up happening was this like really beautiful sort of like exhibition. It's not, the gallery was not the best gallery, I feel like it would have been nice to have an actual functioning gallery. But my dad came through at one point and helped me construct these walls, and we just kind of like fucked around with layout and design. Initially the emphasis for Bury My Art at Wounded Knee came from wanting to have artwork that was very political and very politically charged. I was thinking like activist posters, but what it actually ended up coming through were these different forms and styles of artwork that was utilizing traditional methodologies as a way to continue like these legacies of Indigenous art making, but they were also blending in contemporary practices. The exhibition exhibited, had a very strong contingent of like queer and femme energy and matriarchal artists, as well as artists who were, playing with like traditional Indigenous themes within their work, but artists who are also utilizing contemporary forms of, street art and graffiti and as a means of getting their work out there. At the time, I was thinking about this idea of this like imagined collective. I remember, going through the whole thesis proposal and sitting down in front of the panel and talking about, RISE, Radical Indigenous Survivance and Empowerment. I was thinking of it more in terms of like this imagined collective. I wanted to, I thought about making and generating all this artwork and just stamping it, RISE, Radical Indigenous Survivance and Empowerment, pushing it out there into the world through street art and Tumblr and like different social media sites. But as I was going through the whole thesis process, a lot of the feedback I kept getting was like, what if this thing actually existed? And so throughout, the Bury My Art at Wounded Knee exhibition, the initiative, which eventually became known as RISE, was born. And so this is some of the first work that I created after being in school at PNCA. We had a lot of posters that were disseminated through Tumblr. They were all made available for free download for people to print out, wheat paste. One of these pieces was actually the No Way Feminism piece, was just commissioned for inclusion in an exhibition in Miami, and when I had pushed when I had like filled out all the paperwork to have this piece utilized in the exhibition, they had asked for the exhibition history. At which point, I just wrote them back and was like, the exhibition history of this piece is like irrelevant. Because some of the first forms of this piece being exhibited were like in people's houses, were on the street, were on the side of a trailer. You can't create like a thorough exhibition history of something that is made available for free. And so throughout this whole process, I think it's also important that we talk about the ways that we actually democratize our artwork, and think outside of legitimization of what is deemed valuable or worthy of inclusion through our resumes or CVs. These are some other posters that we created through the RISE initiative. RISE was also asked to participate in Converge 45, and so we had partnered with Wintercount and Post Commodity to install a piece that was to exhibit a piece that was installed inside of Reed's the canyon they have just outside of their campus, and this piece came inspired by Standing Rock. The Standing Rock, No Dakota Access Pipeline, resistance and movement. And so this piece was installed more so for the land. It was a piece that was talking about like resource extraction. We had all these rape whistles that were hanging from the trees that said land is body, body is land. There were some pieces, these little gold panels that were installed in the canyon that had various slogans and prompts on them. This one says, "Even after rape, this land continues to breathe and grow life." We also had a piece by Post Commodity, a motel butchering, a Navajo woman who was butchering a sheep inside of a motel. That was also on exhibit. And then we worked with Purdue Bois Press to have a takeaway component that had a poem by Wintercount and a text piece by Rise that just says land is body, land is body, land is body, and a quote by Sarah Deer that says the journey of a rape survivor to regain a sense of self-worth and self-determination often presents a microcosm of the journey of a tribal nation to revitalize its own self-worth and self-determination. Rise is also asked to do an exhibition at Pioneer Works out in Brooklyn. And so for this exhibition, we focused on police violence and mass murders. At the time, there was a lot of like rhetoric going around, especially on social media and through the news, that was talking about, this is the largest mass shooting in U.S. history. So, Rise really took it upon ourselves to think about like what that actually means within the history of the United States. And so we started to tease out these moments in U.S. history of where larger incidences of like genocidal acts against indigenous tribes are continuations and histories of like mass murder and massacre that we oftentimes ignore. Wounded Knee, is one of the largest mass murder events in, U.S. history. The fact that it's done and orchestrated by the U.S. Army, yet isn't classified as such, is a further example of the ways that indigenous communities are completely erased from, very public histories. So, we had utilized the risograph as a means to create this entire exhibition. So you'll see a lot of the, I was also really interested in thinking about like exhibiting artwork in like in a non-conventional way, utilizing different parts of the gallery wall that don't oftentimes get utilized as a way to like both fuck with the viewer, but also like fuck with, museum exhibition like standards and histories. installing the work in this way, it has to have like a very sort of like precarious hand at play, but also the audience and the museum goer and the public have to like reorient themselves in these like unconventional ways in order to like engage and read a lot of the text pieces. So these are just some of the prints that I had printed on the risograph. This one is displayed on the floor with like, I forget what the fuck that plastic covering is called. Plexiglass. There you go. It's just installed with plexiglass, holding it down to the floor. A lot of risograph printers were actually used in like schools and churches, and so I also think of my re-engagement with these objects as like a way like to further the discussion. And I've talked to like Tracy and other letterpress, Rory and other letterpress geeks and punks and heroes about the history even of letterpress. Like letterpress and risograph, a lot of the times when we reutilize these objects and technologies, like we're continuing and radicalizing those histories of them. I imagine that like one of these Riso printers could have been like pushing out like, homophobic pamphlets. And so my re-engagement with them to like tell a different story, to implant a different history into them, in that way is reasserting the types of like power and control that we have as individuals over our community and cultural legacies. The exhibition also utilized window vinyl as a way to engage with like public and private space. And so this piece that says "A Nation is a Massacre," if you just moved to the right and were to look out, it like overlooked like Wall Street and the at the time the construction of the new World Trade Center. This other one was installed in Seattle, right outside the baseball stadium or whatever that thing is. And then we had a more sort of like site-specific, regional-specific installation at for the Portland Biennial back in 2019. Rise also worked at Recess in New York City for one of their sessions to basically jam-pack like an entire month's worth of curation. We were able to bring together, Jeffrey Gibson, Laura Ortman, Ginger Dunnell. We had a panel discussion with Maria Hupfill, Jeffrey Gibson, Shanupa Hanska-Luger, a film screening with Clea Benally. And this was sort of like our opportunity to showcase what Indigenous-led like programming and initiatives can do in colonial spaces. The fact that like I was able to have a conversation with Jeffrey Gibson about our shared sort of like queer histories and queer stories is something that, a space like the Whitney or even or MoMA or the Met fails to do like on a yearly basis. We're not oftentimes brought into these spaces to like talk about even the ways that we've like come to terms with our sexuality being Indigenous people. A written component was also published by Lou Cornum. And Rise also puts out Survive. And so, I was really, I've been enamored by zines my entire life. Growing up in the 90s and growing up in Gallup, I didn't really like have immediate access to that. Most of, my sort of like curiosities and introduction to zines came through websites. It came through just like trying to look and find out like what these things look like, how I could like make them, like ways that I could make them. So when I started building the Survivance zine, it was a really good opportunity for me to sort of like think about the history of zines and the evolution of zines. And so I wanted to, work primarily out of like Illustrator and digital forms of design, as a way to continue to like push the culture of like zine forward, of zine making forward. I love the whole like Xerox aesthetic and everything, but I think what I was really interested in exploring in this way was figuring out ways that I could figure out how to self-publish or put out, larger publications on my own. Again, speaking back to my time here at PNCA and some, my introduction to like the letterpress and working with the letterpress came through PNCA's letterpress program here and through Abra Enclave. And so, a lot of my sort of like first initial assignments was like thinking about the queer histories of the letterpress, of self-publishing. I got really interested in like Hogarth Press and Virginia Woolf and, Oscar Wilde and Gertrude Stein. Some of like their publications were like put out either through self-published means. But, again, like a lot of this entire history as well, like has traditions in letterpress and these like small press publications. So that eventually led me to thinking about, figuring out ways that I could publish on my own. Ancestral Memory was the first book I put out in 2018. The first half of the book is actually my thesis here at PNCA, titled Tribal Memory, Post-Apocalyptic Landscape Representation and Indigenous Survivance. And so all of these books have been printed on the risograph, and they were printed and, partially designed. An Infected Sunset was partially designed, and the layout and packaging conceived by John Akira Harold. So I think also one way that was really empowering for me as like a self-published writer was also realizing that, I had the authority over what I wanted to put out into the world. So, I'm able to determine like what my voice sounds like. I am the editor, I guess, of the entire piece as well. But I'm the one who is like who is continually having jurisdiction over my own voice. And so I think, as a self-publishing writer, that is something that is really like hardcore important for myself. When I published An Infected Sunset, I went back and realized that like I had misspelled some names. I had misspelled words. I had left certain things out. I left an entire poem out. And so, I think this also lends itself to ways that like publishing in, at any point is an act in failure. Like we're never going to get it right. And so, but for We Left Them Nothing, it was like my one attempt to actually get it right. And so, coming into the pandemic, I was really thinking about what it meant to like create a work, during the pandemic. We Left Them Nothing, I had originally planned to release in 2020 in the spring, but I didn't end up releasing it probably till a whole like year and a half later. And so what eventually ends up, sorry, we can just skip through this. Oh, actually, sorry. Sorry, I was trying to skip over this, but I'll get back to the We Left Them Nothing. So these are just some examples of the book itself. This is Ancestral Memory. It's all printed in black and red risograph ink. This is an infected sunset printed in red and indigo purple. So half of this book is in chapbook form, and then the other half of the book exists as unbound pages. And so I refer to that second half as the liberated poem. This is just an example of the layout and design. So for We Left Them Nothing, I was, continuing to think about like ways that we disrupt, viewership, readership, the public, like engaging with objects. How could I, and this is something that like I thought about like as like even before the pandemic, but something that like through the pandemic, I think, just felt like it was so much more enriched, having a personal object that you had to like reorient and engage yourself with, but also that was through this entire process was also this like intimate, this like very intimate act. I mean, reading is an intimate act, whatever, but like, having to like reconsider how your relationship with like this object is. I really wanted to push that with We Left Them Nothing. And so the entirety of the book is published sideways or upside down. It isn't until the very last poem that you see, the page in the more like conventional right side up. So these are just some examples of the layout and design. Oh shit, sorry. All right, I have a Venmo, or Vimeo. I have a Venmo too, but yeah, so you can just, if you're ever interested, you can see some of this work. But this is actually a video that I made for a theory and practice course here at PNCA. But I'm going to just show this one instead. So this is an excerpt from an infected sunset that was just made for like a short video promo exhibition. We must collectively stop imagining, I'll read this real quick, sorry. We must collectively stop imagining apocalypse or future world order dystopia. We must stop imagining destruction, oil fields, deforestation, cages, animal displacement, surveillance, and future genocide. We must stop giving away these ideas because they result in the perpetual construction of imprisonment. We must stop doing this imagining for the sake of subversive prophecy. They result in capitalist appropriation, simulated delusion, environmental destruction, gender, violence, erasure, and death. We must stop predicting apocalypses and fascist governmental hierarchies on behalf of post-colonial psychosis and power-hungry heteropatriarchal degenerates. Come on. Yeah, so a lot of the work that I created during a lot of the rest of this is just work that I had created during the pandemic. I was trying to, figure out like what it meant to be an artist making work during the pandemic. Feeling like this like weird sort of like guilt that anything that I was putting out was potentially profiting off of, the pandemic, everything like death and destruction. I think initially at the start of it, a lot of artists were, we were pushing our work out that was relating to it. And I jumped in on that and thought it was, a moment for us at least to examine where we had been prior as artists, where we had been culturally and put it in relationship to what we were actually going through. And I couldn't really find a lot of the language or inspiration to create work or to want to create work. You know, a lot of my platform and Rise's platform quickly shifted from producing new work to, you know, helping others amplify messages, whether it was like mutual aid or like collectives who were doing these really meaningful projects and engagements with communities. You know, a lot of that work shifted, and then we had, you know, Black Lives Matter and police violence and George Floyd like spring up, and you know, in the middle of that, in the middle of 2020, you know, I was asked to go out to ISCP, which is the International Studio and Curatorial Program in Brooklyn, to pursue this residency that they invited me to do, like, you know, a year prior to that. I wasn't sure how I was going to navigate or be in that space. And so, you know, my time there, I arrived like in the middle of like, that like weird lull period between like when all the energy of like the Black Lives Matter movement was in New York, and then all of a sudden all the attention was in Portland. And so I went there thinking that like I would engage with like a lot of, you know, New York activists and like trans activists and queer activists. But a lot of that energy had like disseminated. You know, there weren't as many people like out in the streets, but I suddenly was like away from Portland where like national attention was like blowing up. And so I didn't really know how to make work during this time. So, you know, toward the end of my time at ISCP, I ended up just thinking about like making these banners and having these, and what does it mean to like make a banner as an artist? What does it mean to exhibit work? And what does it mean to like have all of a sudden these like art institutions like throwing out these solidarity statements of support? Only to realize that like in a year from now, like none of their shit's gonna change. Like it's gonna be like all over the place, and like we're still gonna be like trying to like get funding and support. And so I started just painting these banners as a way to create a conversation within like either institutional spaces or outside of that. And so these banners that I created, you know, they're meant to be on display in, you know, exhibitions with the realization and intention that if these banners need to be used for any sort of like protest or organizing or event or anything, that, you know, the institution in agreeing to showing this work also agrees to lend it out, and that once it gets lent out to the public, then the public then is responsible for bringing it back in whatever condition that it's in, and then the banners can then be put back up. So yeah, I created these pieces as like an experiment, but the only one that's ever been put up has been this one, and it's currently up right now in LA. Another piece I created during the pandemic was Destroy the Myth. Not every space deserves you. Not every space is sacred. This one was installed at the Wexner in Columbus, Ohio. It's the largest piece. It was also installed recently at Oregon Contemporary. And it's the largest neon piece that I've installed. And then another piece I created in 2020 was another iteration of My Ancestors Will Not Let Me Forget This. Every American flag is a warning sign. And this was created out at Stello Arts in Colton, Oregon, just outside of town. Driving out there to do the residency, you just pass, like, especially in 2020, you just pass like a shit ton of like American flags. And so it just was like, oh, fuck, like, of course I need to like make a piece that responds to like this time period, this route, this like journey out here. And so, yeah, I was able to put out 13 prints, one of them that is imperfect. Each print is available for sale for $1,776. And each of them, except for Indigenous people, it's $1,491. And each print is not numbered, but named after one of the first, colonial states. It's originally based off of a neon sign I created for the Honolulu Biennial. And then coming into 2022, I'm kind of thinking about like reconnecting and re-engaging with like art spaces. I think the past 2 years like really broke me, and it broke a lot of artists. I also think a lot of my like gender story and suppression, or like self-suppression, kind of like came up. A lot of like gender issues came up, and as I've talked more to people or shared more of this, I've also realized that a lot of people have like dealt with a shit ton of like gender issues, or and so I think there was a moment during the pandemic where I was navigating that and trying to figure out like my own path. But I was also just really, again, speaking to like a lot of these solidarity statements and the extraction and exploitation of institutional spaces and their unwillingness to change. I realized that like I had moments where I was like questioning whether or not I wanted to like continue forward as an artist. So there was a point like a year ago where like I almost like just dipped out and worked at Nordstrom or something. I don't know. But I kept just coming back to like, the desire to create. I had just put out We Left Them Nothing, and like I wasn't able to tour. So I was like, okay, I need to at least give some energy to this book before I like figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And thankfully, I think it led to me like revisiting a lot of the conversations that we had as people like in 2020. A lot of these things that we were asking for, a lot of these like future spaces and like worlds and communities that we wanted, a lot of that I think is like still really worthy of like our attention and like energy right now. And so the only way that I can really like focus on that within myself is like through a visual art practice, is through photography, is through text, is through poetry. And so I started to work on these like photo murals, and again, working outside in like public spaces, working outside of like art galleries and institutions as a way to like continuously engage with the public and allow people like access to art, but also allow people access to critique. Because for the most part, a lot of the work that I created during the pandemic in the last 2.5 years has mostly existed on Instagram. I think of it as like my sketchbook, as my notebook, as these like foundational, as this like foundational space for me to like work out a lot of my shit. And so this piece, I think, comes from an Instagram post. Art spaces are currently failing artists by forcing us to participate in the same toxic game that existed prior to the pandemic without asking us what we need to survive and resume productivity. They wrote solidarity statements to ensure their survival, yet nothing has changed. The modes of production are just as exhausting, debilitating, depressing, demanding, and unnecessary. I want to believe that the future worlds we thought were possible 2 years ago are still worthwhile objectives that demand our care, attention, and fury. I want us all to remember that glorious energy that helped us survive dark times. I want us all to continue fighting for all the brilliant futures that defy the current extractive conditions that fuel contemporary art. I want to believe that these things still matter as we go along murmuring the chorus to the same old song, depleted, disenchanted, jaded, and heartbroken. I want you all to remember that there were artists who questioned these times and demanded more than praise, representation, inclusion, solidarity statements, or land acknowledgements. Oh, sorry. I'm going to skip over just this shit real quick. Do institutions dream? I made this recently. While I was in like a Zoom meeting, and someone from a museum on the East Coast was like talking about like, oh, we've been like dreaming this exhibition into existence, and like we've been dreaming about having this thing exist in the world, and like this is finally our chance to do it after the pandemic, after yada yada yada. And I was just like, do institutions actually dream? Like, are they actively like dreaming, or are they co-opting our language and ideas? Are they using our ideas to like further validate what they're doing? Is like them saying that they're dreaming like a new form of like a solidarity statement or a land acknowledgement? Is it a new way for them to like, slide into our like inboxes or DMs or emails and like asking us to like do shit for free, or at the same budget that we've been doing it for the last like 5 years, yet the cost of living has gone up. So at this point, I'm still interested in thinking about working in the letterpress. I'm going to be going out to Stallo Arts again to work on a new sort of like letterpress series of letterpress prints. I really want to think about like working, Instagram, like even though it's a very problematic and fucked up space for various reasons, a lot of it being surveilled and whatnot. I still think of like working with it, especially with Instagram stories, as like a way for me to work in a way that is similar to like printmaking. I'm able to just put together like a very quick like text print. This red, which I use a lot in my work, is actually I actually just use it. It's just my finger over the camera, like pointed toward the sun. And I just did that like in the Instagram app. And then I started like putting text over it. And so, this was just a really quick way for me, especially during the pandemic, and for a lot of people, it's been a very quick way for us to get out these messages. But just because it's a digital technology, just because it's like a social app, doesn't take away from the fact that it is a continuation and like in screen printing history. But I also want to work outside of that. I also want these things to exist. I also want like my critique and text pieces and voice to like exist outside of, the algorithm. I want them, and the only ways that I can think to have this work exist inside of a museum is to actually have an art piece that they'll put on the wall. So it's, this is an experiment going forward with these letterpress prints, but I'm hoping that by, creating these letterpress posters that they're then able to get exhibited in institutions and begin like a process of having, a very valid like critique of institutions. Because that's something that is like really missing right now. And I think one thing that we really missed, that we didn't realize we had the ability to do, and so we didn't do it in 2020, was like demand institutions give up a lot of those resources. They put out these solidarity statements because they knew that by doing that, we would look the other way and put all our energy into our communities, which we needed, but like we could have done all that at the same time. We could have demanded that the Met the Whitney, MoMA, New Museum, the Portland Art Museum, that any of these spaces, we could have demanded that they give up land and resources to Indigenous, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, queer, trans communities of, marginalized communities. But they put out these solidarity statements, and it's just really maddening. Because then we're putting into these positions where it feels as though like we are at war with ourselves or at war with other artists in order to even get any type of like visibility, in order to get any type of like exhibition opportunity. Yeah, and it's just not, it's fucked. So I'm kind of thinking about like, okay, if I'm going to go back into making work, which I want to do, I need it to be critical. I need to like continue to have these conversations. I thoroughly believe that like, even when we like fail, we still create opportunities for other people to succeed. Even when we burn a bridge, I'm sure I burned a bridge with somewhere like the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. But like by doing so, I think speaking up against ways that, even the NACF has been, had been unsupportive of, very outspoken Indigenous, queer, trans artists, it's led to them being more receptive and realizing that like there is a power that they gain from actually funding marginalized communities. And this is something that is like obviously really fucked up, but has taken institutions like decades to realize is like there is power in supporting every single person. And so I want to leave today with a few thoughts that I'm going to read off. There's a future world where we thrive without MoMA, the Met, the Whitney, New Museum, Crystal Bridges, or same old song art institutions. There's a future world where we succeed without needing gallery representation. There's a future world where our creative practices are respected and nurtured. There's a future world where our traumas, radical ideologies, and resilient ancestral fires are honored and not exploited. I didn't mean to include this, but I'll read it real quick. I don't want to get disillusioned that these future spaces aren't unimaginable. I think we discredit our work and power by not trying or continually supporting people in spaces that are actively doing this work. Institutions are extractive industries. We are not indebted to institutions. We do not owe them our allegiance just because they exhibit our work. Just because they exhibited our work does not mean they are exempt from our critique. Their power exists as a result of religious, heteropatriarchal, colonial, and capitalist conquests. Their legitimacy is dependent on our validation. Their relevance is determined by our subjugation, compliance, and exploitation. I think these things are like bullet points, actually, to like larger conversations and essays or whatnot. Because I think, yeah, I mean, anyway, sorry. I just hope that we continue to think about these things because like they're really important. Like, oftentimes I feel like having these conversations because I'm getting paid or because I'm getting exhibited. I feel like this like weird tension even bringing them up, calling the Whitney out or the Met out, even realizing that I have like friends who work there or who have worked there, who do have radical perspectives, who do have radical ideologies, who do want these actual spaces to exist. I mean, how we've I'm sure many of you in this room have worked or are working for institutions that you want to change. That at one point you came into your work thinking, oh, fuck, I can change this space from within. And you know, have spent years and decades trying to change these spaces only to make little progress, or only to have someone else come in and say that, like, we can't actually change these things. We're going to literally go back to the way we did things before. You know, I feel like there just are moments where we feel like just because we are that we have navigated these spaces or profited off of these spaces, or that they paid us like a measly like honorarium to like help us pay rent for 2 months, that we somehow, you know, are putting our foot in our mouths, or like burning a bridge whenever we speak up about ways that they're being problematic. I don't think that's the way that we should continue to go forward, and I don't think that ever needs to be normalized. So I hope we all like continue to think about these things. As artists, it is important as ever to question our role and function in institutional spaces. It is important as ever to question the future of institutions in our communities. It is important as ever to question the gatekeepers and bureaucratic processes that assert invented power and authority over what is considered worthy, valuable, archivable, collectible, or exhibitable. It is important as ever to challenge galleries in our communities that appropriate our strategies and radical ideologies, yet do not align with the futures we need in order to survive and thrive beyond this simulation. I'm just going to wrap up right there, but thank you all so much. Yes, yeah.
Do we have any questions in the audience? I'll come over with a...
Firstly, thank you so much for making the space to start this dialogue. It's so important, especially today, to have these conversations. And so I greatly admire like your use of language and symbolism within the blend of traditional and modern printmaking techniques. With that being said, with like the book that you created that was half unbinded, do you note these little moments of symbolism next to your work or within your pieces? Or do you want the viewer to come to these conclusions within interpreting your work? Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No, it's good. Okay, so I think in putting out a book, especially as a self-published writer, like you also are, I think there is a relationship as well with you. I mean, it's a sort of like radical trust that you build with yourself. You know, like putting out this work is like it's very vulnerable, even like to hand it off to a publisher, I'm sure, or someone else to edit. Mm-hmm. But you know, I don't think we speak enough in self-publishing about like the amount of trust that we like put in ourselves to create that work. Because it makes me really vulnerable, really realizing that like I have typos, you know, that I fucked up someone's name, that I left out a poem. But I also think there's an enormous amount of like trust that we put into our viewer and like the reader, and on the other end of it as well. I think once you put that work out, like you can, you know, guide the viewer as much as you can to what you're going to say or what you want to be said or what the interpretation of that is, but they're always going to change that. They're always going to build their own relationship with it. They're all, you know, people are going to what am I trying to say? People are going to reinterpret, you know, the text, the meaning, and supplant new meaning and ideas onto it. And maybe, and with like the Rise posters as well, you know, putting those out and making them available for free, like, I also want the work to be appropriated, to be subverted, to be like unsettled. And so I think in doing this, and especially with that book, An Infected Sunset, like I love the fact that like half of the book is unbound, that half of the pages could be like blown away in the wind. The pages could be gifted to somebody else, could be used as a receipt, could be used as like, kindling or anything, like I like the fact that in this way, like we are also thinking outside of like the preciousness of like our objects. What is that sort of like relationship? Like why isn't like destruction also like another form of like maintaining the preciousness of something? Does that answer your question? I
Beautifully
hope.
said. Thank you so much for letting me pick your brain. Does anyone else have a question?
Thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you. When or how do you know that a space is not worth your energy or effort and it's just time for you to leave?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know. When you're fed up, I guess. I don't know. When I think you just know. I think for the longest time I didn't know. I think when you arrive to when you've had to work with like so many institutions or spaces, and I actually no, like I'm really thankful having like worked in Portland and like worked alongside a lot of Portland artists. A lot of the times when I go to other places, like people like scowl or get like a like shitty sort of like response. They give a shitty response to me if I tell them I'm from Portland. I had one person be like, "Oh, I'm sorry." I was like, "I'm not sorry. Like, yeah, Portland is rough and it's like really hard right now, but like there are a shit ton of like amazing Portland artists and like activists and individuals out there who have like affected like my practice." I mean, there's a ton of Portland artists who like are invested in like the process of like refusal, of saying no. And so I think, to some extent, like that was always just sort of like embedded, thankfully, into my practice of being like, okay, like this doesn't feel right. I don't think I need to like involve myself here. Or like the first time that I was asked to like exhibit work at the Whitney, I sat down with two of the curators and they were like, we're not really focusing on collectives or anything. Like, we want to work with like individual artists. And I was like, well, if you're going to work with me, if you're going to work with Indigenous artists, like you need to realize that like we bring like our community with us. So if you're going to work with me, you're going to agree to the fact that like I want to collaborate with somebody else. And they were open to it. So I think, there's also like areas and times where we're able to be like, okay, like, no, we need to ask for what we need. If we're in these spaces and like we feel shifty or weird about what they're doing, we need to like make sure that we're getting what we need as artists in order for us to go forward. Because at that moment, like I realized that I was putting myself into a position where like I could not have been shown at like, a prestigious, institution or whatnot. But, I just don't think that artists realize enough of the time that like we do have a voice and we can ask for things. And that most of the time, people will respond favorably. But I can't remember the last time I said no, like flat out, like I'm not working with you. At least so like explicitly, I mean, there's other things where I just don't respond to an email, but yeah. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi. I was really interested when you were talking about sort of disrupting sort of dystopian narratives.
Oh, yeah.
And I was curious how it like corresponded with the questioning of institutional spaces and stuff like that. Is it towards like rejecting a fictionalization of dystopia, or is it toward like, because there's things that exist in the world like climate grief and stuff like that, where it's like this very like, obviously you're aware things are fucked up, and so like, where is the like line between a utopian future aspect of this and the like rejection of dystopian ideas, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, that whole, you're talking about like the, we must stop imagining. Okay. Yeah, see, I don't know, because like, I don't know how to answer that. Because the exhibition Bury My Art at Wounded Knee, Blood and Guts in the Art School Industrial Complex. Blood and Guts in the Art School Industrial Complex is it is appropriative, or it's borrowed from Kathy Acker's Blood and Guts in High School. And Kathy Acker is very like dystopic and like punk and subversive in her writing. But that piece is more so, I think, responding to like The Handmaid's Tale or like 1984 or We. And so, I was thinking about like of all this like imagining that we do, and how that gets like subverted by, people with power or influence, people with the internet, or people who control the internet. They get like, those ideas then get like subverted and utilized as like actual means to control like communities and societies. And so I was thinking like, okay, like what if we actually stopped giving so much power over to these ideas of like apocalypse and like dystopia and like the end of the world? Because I mean, the world's it's gonna figure out its shit whether we're here or not, People keep saying like, oh, the dying planet, and it's like, no, like the Earth is gonna be okay. It's, human civilization that, anyway, whatever. So I feel like, it's important for us to, and I think, this goes into like institutional critique as well, and thinking about the future spaces that we build for ourselves. It's important for us to think about like solutions and ways of like building actual functional spaces outside of what we currently have. And I think about this especially being in Portland and seeing like the houseless crisis, the inept, or not, sorry, the useless mayor, and whatnot. I think about like the fact that, if everything that we were asking for was delivered to us tomorrow, like, could we actually build a space that we needed? Because I see people like dining on like 23rd, and somebody is like just a block away having like a mental health crisis on the sidewalk. And so I don't think we're there yet, we're very clearly not there yet, and so I think it's important for us to continually push these ideas forward of being like, okay, we don't need this, like, we need to dismantle that. We need to stop thinking about, apocalypse or extractive industry. I think it's just as important for us to actually realize like what types of solutions do we actually implant and how do we start to build that and those models like into our communities. And I think a lot of that has to do like by imagining and writing and creating. What would it be like if we wrote novels or I was just thinking of this the other night. Like I was watching a movie with my partner and I was like, okay, like what if I know we were watching a preview for like Avatar or something. And I was like, okay, like what is like, what's the threat in the storyline? Like what's the fucked up thing that like people are going to like need to come to terms with? Like, and that's with any story, like there has to be like a really fucked up moment when like someone goes through like some self-realization or something gets healed or something. But it's like, why can't we just create stories where like we succeed, where like people survive, and be okay with that? Like we've been conditioned into like these storylines or ways of thinking where like we need some like devastating fucked up event in order for us to like come to terms with, I don't know, changing the world and making things better. So I think, I'm interested in the idea of what types of stories and art and like spaces we can create from imagining the fact that like we do succeed. That in 10 years that, trans people have rights, that, there's reproductive and like body sovereignty, that indigenous people, are cared for, that, sovereignty and like Black liberation are realized. I think a lot of that comes through storytelling. It comes through figuring out how we nurture that imagination like in our communities. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Hello. In the work, I kind of see some either explicit or implicit reference to artists like Zoe Leonard and Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger. So I guess I'm just wondering how do you think about that intertextual relationship with these white women artists and how you're appropriating that or speaking back to that? Or
well, Barbara Kruger doesn't own Red.
more words.
So, no, I love all those artists. I like went through my entire like initial art career being like very enamored by them. But I think I think they're a part of a generation that helped another generation figure out like very basic ideas of liberal, agenda and philosophy. But I think they stopped there. I don't think that they moved into any sort of like radical space where, because so there's a piece that is featured in A Nation as a Massacre, and it's a piece that is based off of a Zoe Leonard piece titled, I don't want a president, or I want a president. Is that what it is? What was it? I want a dyke for president. Yes. Thank you. And so, when I kept seeing that piece, like, put up, like, it was put up, in the High Line in New York City. It was put all over Instagram, especially during the early Trump campaign years. And, at this time, Standing Rock was also going on. And I was like, this is really great. And this is empowering. And like 18-year-old me who's like, fuck yes, like let's have gay marriage and blah, 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 I'll, keep on living, La Tigra, whatever. Like all this shit, I was like so stoked about, and like I felt it like so hard, like, but as I'm like looking at my community and like realizing that we're coming out of like the Pulse nightclub shooting, police like brutality against Black communities and people of color, the Standing Rock occupation, I was like, this isn't enough. Like, this isn't serving any of us. Like, it is still legitimizing the settler colonial nation state. How can I, how can I reference this work, but also like update it and like indigenize it? How can I challenge this type of mindset? And I feel bad that it has to be like these artists, but it's work that I actually admire and respect. And it's work that I think needs to be challenged. It's ideas and like philosophies that like need to be challenged. And so that piece that I responded to for the I Want a Dyke for President, it starts off saying, we don't want a president. We don't want tribal presidents. We don't want, a white liberal critique of like settler colonialism. And it ends by saying like, we want to worship only the earth. And so, I think white liberalism in general needs to continually be checked and challenged. I do find that there is hope and possibility there, especially in helping people like move into like more radical spaces of thinking. So I do like respect that to a certain degree, but I do think that that art spaces and artwork in general are really wonderful spaces for us to continue to push these conversations forward. Jenny Holzer, I have a t-shirt and design and a poster that says, we, what the fuck does it say?
In a dream.
In a dream, you saw a way to decolonize and you were full of joy. Her original text said, in a dream, you saw a way to survive and you were full of joy. Again, it's like, what do we actually need to survive? Like, as individuals, as human beings at this moment, like we need, an anti-colonial, decolonial space in order for us to actually feel like fulfillment and joy and pleasure. So again, I think it's just revisiting these texts and challenging artists from like a specific generation to like do better.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yes.
You are showing work in some of the most renowned museums in the world, and then you also have an Etsy and, are on Instagram and make your work really accessible to, at prices that like the average person can afford. Can you talk a little bit about the choice you made to do that, especially to a room with some students and, folks who are earlier in their art careers?
Yes, I can. That's a wonderful question. Okay, so I think it's sometimes a mistake to have accessibility because, okay, so I had a conversation like back in 2019 with someone, and I was like, why aren't more, institutions like collecting my work? Why aren't places like buying my work? And I had a couple people actually come back and they were like, oh, well, it might be because you have like an Etsy, you sell your prints, in these like smaller spaces, like your work is like so accessible that like to a museum collector or a private collector, they become less interested in buying your work because it's so accessible. They want something that is like a little bit more rare. But I can't like move away from that, and I don't believe that's true either. I mean, Keith Haring and other art, Shepard Fairey or whatever, they have like museum shops. They've sold a shit ton of work. So I think, you know, I don't know where I'm going with that, but you know, Etsy was like one of the initially before, I mean, my earliest forms of like actually producing and selling work just came through like selling zines and prints. The Etsy shop started off because I wanted to figure out ways to fund Rise and a lot of the work that we were doing. More so, the Etsy shop gained more traction, and like I started to put more energy into it. Was when I was rejected from a grant from the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and I had a conversation with the president there or the director there, and I had said like, why aren't you giving more, you know, fellowships to like Indigenous, queer, trans, two-spirit artists? And at the time they were like, well, we know that concern of yours. We've, you know, other artists have like voiced that as well. You know, we maybe next year you can like share our call for, you know, fellowships with like your community. And I was like, one way you do that is by giving me money. Like that's the way you share it with, that's the way I share it with my community, is by showing other artists in my community that like you see that it's worth funding. And so after that time I was like, well, fuck this. Like I don't think I'm going to apply to you anymore until I see that you do better. And then I went ahead the next year and was like, if you're not going to fund my community, then I'm going to have to be the person to do that. Like, and so you know, it was very small at the time. Like we were only able to give out like $2,000 to like 3 artists. But you know, that effectively, we figured I just started up like a autonomous, like self-funded, like fellowship for Indigenous, queer, trans, two-spirit artists. And so then at that point I started to like work more with the Etsy store as a way to figure out more funding for that type of project. So yeah, my entire like Etsy store and like that whole space actually comes from like wanting to figure out ways that I could like have funding for the work that I do through social media, on the Rise page, but also as a way to like provide like mutual aid efforts through a Rise Fellowship. And then with the larger types of like, I have no fucking idea about like even selling my work to larger institutions or whatnot, you know? I don't think any institution in the Portland area so far has, you know, bought my work at this point. There was a post that the Portland Art Museum put up like a year and a half ago that was like solidarity with whatever community. I forget what, I don't think it was solidarity. I forget. They put up some post about like community engagement. And I was like, well, are you actually going to like support local artists? Like, are you going to actually purchase work by local artists and put it into your collections? Because I don't think that there's enough work being done on a local and regional level to be supporting work even in Portland. So I think a lot of that needs to change. I don't know how to change it. You know, I don't know how to like get in there and say, you need to buy my fucking work. But I also realize that it's not just my work, like it's other people's work. There's a shit ton of artists in the Portland community who need that work in there right now. There's a lot of, you know, artists in general who like need support right now. Like I shouldn't be out there coming up with my own fellowship to like support a community that gets underfunded or underrealized and give it to, you know, hopefully artists who it's their first time getting a grant, and they're able to put that onto their application so they can apply for other grant opportunities. the bureaucratic processes that like artists are forced to contend with on a daily basis are really fucked up. And so going back to the question that was just asked, I think it's important that we continue to just figure out ways that we as artists, as we go through our education, as we come out of the art institution, as we move about communities that sometimes feel like they're breaking or falling apart, that we figure out ways that we can survive and support one another. But more importantly, create spaces that we need to exist that like serve ourselves and each other, and that are totally capable of like being funded, maintaining funding, and like support for other artists. Because a lot of the times, I feel like we get a cute space, we get a good space in Portland, and then it disappears or dissolves, or they start to focus more on like what is profitable, what will make them money. And that's not the art community or the art space that we need. Like, we need all people contributing to the conversation. We need all people having an equal say-so. I think our institution should actually be asking artists right now, like, what do we need to survive? What do we need in order to feel secure, safe, and empowered to even be producing work right now? And none of them are asking us that. They're all making it feel as though that we should be thankful for whatever space we do get. So yeah, I hope that's...
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really beautiful talk, and thanks to all of you for coming out to the 2022 Graduate
thank you.
Symposium.